Hello there. So I'm Rebecca Howell. I'm Rebecca Haller, and thrilled to be joined by Harrison Scott Key. And just before we dive in here, quick few thank yous to give out. Certainly, thank you to 1455 for hosting us here as part of the Lit Fest, and a special thank you to Winchester, Virginia's Blue Plate Books and the owner, Pat Sane, for sponsoring this panel in particular. The Post-its are much appreciated. So I'm excited to be here today and to be talking with Harrison. I've become a multi-month fan of Harrison's now. I think what I've been really loving is that the very last book that I purchased in a bookstore was one by Harrison Scott Key, called Congratulations, Who Are You Again? I picked it up on my last trip back in early March. I was in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and picked it up at a bookstore called Starline Books. And as an aspiring writer myself, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I know you also write about this a good bit. But I'm always drawn to the books that are about writing. I feel like it's very imperative that before you can ever become a writer, you have to read every book that's ever been written about writing. And so I was thrilled to stumble on your book, and then we can certainly get into it a bit more. But so Harrison has written this book as well as The World's Largest Man. And so both of these have kept me great company during quarantine. So thank you, Harrison, for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for having me on. This is one of my first virtual book festivals to participate in, and I think this is fantastic. I mean, the hardest thing about a book festival is being able to get to all the author talks that you want to. I mean, obviously, it's really fun to be in the space and to have that magic of being in space, and then having a book signed. It's fantastic, and meeting people at the book signing table. But all my favorite book festivals, I'll always have at least two authors that I want to see, and they're on at the same time. So this is fantastic that with these virtual book festivals, that people can access different speakers sort of on their own time as well as live. So I think this is great. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, of course. And it probably goes along with my desire to be reading about writing instead of writing. But I think there's also the added perk of being able to see, a writer's home office here, which I believe we're finding you in.
Yes, this is one of my offices here. I have this is a blazer that somebody tried to. I think it's a Brooks Brothers blazer that somebody let me borrow, or they tried to give it to me because it no longer fit them. And blazers are pretty. I'm going to just talk about the blazer for a second. Blazers or sport coats are so funny because they have kept the same basic shape and design, the lapel and the pocket and all that. But I'm always so shocked by how the sizing and how they're made is so different from generation to generation. So this guy wears mostly old grandfather clothes. And so I put this jacket on. It's like a house coat. It came to my knees. And it's supposed to be my size, so I kept it, and I just put it on this dress form. It's actually a female dress form. I don't know if you can see that. Much curvier than the male dress form. And then this is my, so in Georgia or Savannah, Georgia loves parades. We have a parade. It's like a city from 100 years ago. There's a parade every day for something. And it was the Georgia Day Parade, and the theme was suffrage. And so my youngest daughter, so I think third and fourth graders march in it every year. All three of my children have marched in it now. But the theme was suffrage, and my daughter was supposed to be loyalty, which is one of the tenets of the suffrage movement. nevertheless. So there's a loyalty sash now on my female dress form wearing, I guess it's almost a metaphor for suffrage in a way now. She's wearing traditionally men's clothing. And then this is a great painting by a friend of mine. And then there's just a bunch of other crap up there. Oh, and this is, you can't see it. This is like it's this velvet, and it's like a leopard print, but it's like it's really tiny. So I like to call it baby cheetah. It's a baby cheetah wall. So it's very rare.
Very rare. Very rare.
Yeah, just like me. So yes, this is where we are today. And I said this to you earlier, and I'll say it for anybody watching now. I'm experiencing a thunderstorm where I am, and so if you hear it lightning, or if you see it lightning, or if you hear thunder, that's what it is. There's nothing, nobody's fighting in the next room. It's just a storm.
That's good to know. So just to tee us off here, how did quarantine go for you? You survived.
I'm loving it. I love being at home with my family. 24 hours a day is so much fun for me. I love writing, while also I'm very proud to say I was named. I did not win the Teacher of the Year award at my house. My wife won that because we both had to teach our children this spring. Due to the quarantine. But actually, hope I don't get in trouble saying this. My life hasn't been that much different. I'm very grateful that I still work at SCAD. I work at the university and I have a job there, and I'm able to continue writing. And I ride my bike to work. And so it's a very pedestrian, walkable city. So it's not like I all of a sudden no longer had an hour and a half commute. That would have really changed my life, but that didn't change at all. I feel like I work at home half the time anyway. And I already go on lots of walks. And so, if anything, my life has been a little bit better during this. And I think a lot of people have had similar stories. I know things have not been great for a lot of people. People are out of work, or it's just weird. And it is very weird. Mm-hmm. And the weirdness has definitely, it has come back this summer. The weirdness died down a little bit in late spring, and then it got weird again with the rise in cases. But, I'm always a glass half full sort of guy. And so things that I've loved about it, being at home when my children are doing their schoolwork, and them coming into my office to ask for help, that has been awesome. I mean, it gets annoying after a while, but it's so sweet. And I've taught, I taught high school before I taught college, and I used to teach theater classes to little kids. And so I just love teaching, and I love it when my kids need help with a writing project. My 9-year-old would come in and read her recitations that she was writing about this or that story. That was so much fun. And trying to help my 6th grader with her math. My 6th grader is filled with demons, and so she was just crying all the time. But learning how to just be patient with her and help her with math, or our family meals, that we had such great weather. I think everybody in America had great weather this spring. And we sat on the porch, and we had so many meals on our front porch. It was awesome. And then every Thursday night I would have guys over in my driveway, and we would attempt to socially distance. And I mean, we weren't sitting 15 feet, apart or anything, but guys would bring a chair and bring their masks and come over and bring a 6-pack of beer. And we would just sit out on my driveway and talk for like 3 or 4 hours. It was awesome. I never have time to just hang out with guys like on a random Thursday night. So my quarantine has been fantastic. Definitely ready for my kids to have a school to go to in the fall. But otherwise, I'm a lucky man.
That's not just because you were runner-up and Teacher of the Year.
Well, I mean, frankly, my wife was also in charge of the voting, so that could have had something to do with it. My wife she does not like, she was homeschooled, so her education really stops at like a second grade level. Just kidding. I'm kidding. But my wife hates math and she hates writing. She's an incredible parent and an incredible mother, but she hated that aspect of it and actually enjoyed that because my wife is like kind of the permanent room mother for any of my kids' classrooms. So she always knew what was going on with school and I never did. And so the quarantine totally flipped that in a way, which is really cool.
So those were a lot of highs coming out of your quarantine. More highs than lows, which is always good.
A lot of good highs. That's right.
And so I saw I think on Instagram something of yours early on it made me laugh because it was about how your writing in quarantine was like, you were like, everyone else can just chill out. If you don't have the next great American novel, don't worry about it because I do.
Yeah, people were, I mean, I've written a book about writing. I guess it's about other things too. It's about your calling and your how to decide what you want to be when you grow up. And those are questions that have always consumed me since I was very young. And so I guess if I'd become an astronaut, then it would be a book about how to be an astronaut. I just happen to be a writer. And so I guess that's why it's a book about writing. But what's so funny about writers are the worst. Writers love to get, especially whenever they're working on their books or their stories, and it's usually at like midnight or 5 a.m. And they love to get on to Twitter. It's usually Twitter. And talk about how terrible their work is or how hard it is or how dumb it is. And usually as an excuse not to write, it's something to do. And they're always so like, and I know that this is like today's young people are different. Every generation's always a little bit different from the one right before it. But so many writers, new writers and young writers are so sort of fey and timid and like self-doubting. And that's so boring to me to be like, of course it's hard. Like, you don't have to tell anybody that it's hard. Like, we know if somebody can be funny about how hard it is, I love that but to act like it's like you behave like a middle schooler when you act like writing is somehow some sort of curse and that you're so terrible, you'll never be good enough. And so many people during the quarantine were writing about how in the early days of the quarantine were writing about how difficult it was to write during this time and how everybody was saying they should be creative since they're at home more, and how I'm experiencing a lot of trauma right now. So I'm like, what a bunch of babies. Like, and so I just tweeted like, you don't like, it was 1 week where everybody was talking about give yourself space. You don't have to force yourself to create. Right. And I just tweeted.
That came right after the time period where you were seeing all of the memes about, all of the famous writers who did some of their best works during the plague and how they came out. And then like the next week it was, you don't have to create something. You don't have to write the next great American novel.
I know. And then you get all of you're getting advice from this sort of faceless entity of the internet. And so I just felt like I was looking for the tweet here, but I'm not gonna, it would take all day. But I just got so sick of it. And I mean, what's so funny is that my book is so full of that, right? It's so full of the doubt and anxiety and vulnerability. But I think when it's in a book, and this is true of any story, not just stories about writing, I find it when you're sort of vulnerable on social media, it seems a little too performative. It seems like you want attention as well, because that's what you're going to get, right? If you're vulnerable, you're either, if you have bullies in your friends, they'll bully you, but most people are going to say, "What's wrong? Are you okay?" or "Be strong." And so it always seems manipulative and to be vulnerable. Now in a story, it's not, or it's less so, because people are not going to I can't get affirmation, right? They're reading it on their own. I'm not in the room with them. I'm not seeing what their reaction is unless they write a review of the book. So it seems so much more genuine. So writing for me is a place for me to be vulnerable, because I don't believe when people like, I hate the internet and I hate what people are like when they're on it. When people talk about, like, when they say, I'm so angry, I'm shaking. They're lying. They're not shaking. Like, why would they lie like that?
Right.
If they were so angry they were shaking, they wouldn't be tweeting about it. They would be burning a house down. And so it always seems so fake to me. And so anyway, that's why I wrote that tweet. I just feel like sometimes, my father was a coach, and as much as I'm, vulnerable and in touch with my many feelings, and I'm also have that coach side of me that's like, suck it up, like, put on your big girl pants and just stop being a little, what about whatever it is you're trying to do. Like it is fine to whine and complain. Everybody needs a teacher's lounge and a place to complain about whatever it is you do for a living. But at some point, and this was sort of the ultimate, one of the takeaways from this book about writing, is that you just have to sit down and do it, and you have to do it so hard and so fiercely, and because nobody's going to do it for you. Right. And what's so funny is I'm trying to write another book now, and I'm experiencing it all over again. Right. Now, I have the benefit of having written a book, so I know that it's possible. Whereas somebody who hasn't, like, you feel like a complete phony. Right. Like you, Rebecca, you don't know if it's possible for you. Right. And so it actually takes more courage to do what you're doing than for me to write a second or a third or a fourth book. But what's so crazy is that you still have the same feeling, like, this is so dumb. Why am I writing this stupid book? I'm so stupid. Right. Why are writers like this? Why are they so complicated? And because in one of your at one point you talked about the Googling of how to be a writer, and one of my questions was, I'm not sure that I believe that you can be a writer if you have not Googled how to be a writer, how to write a book, or bought every book known to man. I mean, the reason why I really appreciated this book of yours was that it was the first of the however many books about writing that I've read that it felt real. And it also, you touched a lot on the relationships and, with your wife and how that went back and forth. And I think that there's just, I think when you were writing about the Googling and you were compared it to like firefighters, you can Google how to be a firefighter, and there's 5 steps to get there, or however many, but it's very clear. And it's, I would be willing to bet that firefighters aren't reading tons of books and doing a lot of research about how to do it. They just feel like it's their calling. They're just going to go do it. Yeah. I mean, there were like 3 questions in there. I mean, I think I do think, I the life, there are 2 kinds of people in the world. The kind of people who have a lot of questions about what to do with their lives. They feel some measure of confused, but also like called to something great, but they're confused about it. I think that's true of everybody who ever lived. Mm-hmm. But some people can articulate. I mean, you could call that just generalized anxiety about life. What are you supposed to be doing at any one time? What's in some ways what's fun about writing a book or having a big project is you at least kind of know what your life is supposed to be like while you're working on it. Like that's what your duty is. So I think everybody has those questions, and that's what ultimately what drove the creation of this book is like, how do you know what you want to be? And then once you know, how do you be the thing? What do you do? And it's so frustrating, as many universities and books and wise people who exist on the planet, we still have not figured out how to help people figure that out quickly. And it's probably because you can't figure it out quickly, that every person's journey is so kind of impossible. And so, like with writing, I mean, I think in chapter 2 or 3 of the book, I talk about like there's so many questions involved in writing a book, because you have to think about all the different things you have to know how to do that are not instinctive. You have to, first of all, you have to know what words mean and how they fit together. And that, I mean, that's something that everybody who graduates from high school studies every year of their life until they're 18, you know, like, so that's incredibly hard. Just knowing what the words mean and how to use them and how to spell them. I mean, think about how hard writing is, and everybody has to do it. You know, it's not like painting. Not everybody has to take painting classes for 18 years before they graduate. Writing is something that is so impossible, and it's so fundamental to how our culture works. Like, everybody has to do it. I mean, there was a time in the early 90s when everybody thought writing was dying because like MTV was awesome and everybody was watching cable and nobody wrote things anymore, nobody read. And then the internet was invented and now everybody has to write all the time. And so it's in some ways, this sort of golden age for writing because everybody has to do it and consume it. Anyway, the point is that there's so many things like when I decided to write a book, I was like, well, I want to write a funny book, but what kind of book do I write? And then what is it about? Like, those are dumb and very important questions. What is my book about? I don't know. I like reading books and I want to write one. And, you know, generally it's like, well, if your life is interesting, if you've ever been kidnapped by, you know, the Mujahideen or something, then you write a memoir. And if it's not, then you write like a romance or sci-fi or mystery or something. And so I can remember sitting at the coffee shop, like, what kind of book should I write? What is a book? Like the dumbest things. But those questions take so long to answer because they're not just dumb questions. They're actually questions about who you are and what you want to say in the world. And as a mostly funny person, I never gave a second thought to having something to say. I never, ever considered that I had anything to say. I just thought I was just a funny person and therefore I was going to write a funny book. And that's entirely wrong. And probably the most important question that every writer has to ask, and I think this is probably can be adapted for anyone in any job in any life. But it's a question that I was discussing this with a producer of television shows and films, and we were talking about a screenplay that I'm working on, and you know, started talking about TV shows, and she's put a bunch of really great shows on TV, and she's worked a lot of with Netflix and with CBS and others. And I asked her, I was like, what's the most important thing with a new TV show? Like, if you're pitching it to a network, what do you do? Like, when you go into the pitch, do you just show them the script, or what do you do? Because this is the same for a book or a movie or anything. You got to talk about your project. I mean, Rebecca, you worked in journalism, and so you're always having to pitch your editor. Like, here's what the story's about. What do you think? Should I write it? So it's no different for any of these forms of narrative art. And she said, the most important question is, why are you the one, you being like, she's the producer talking to the writer who's pitching the show. Why are you the people to write this show? Why is this your show, the perfect show for you? A similar question I heard from, I'm going to tie this all together into this really beautiful, inspiring idea that I'm not sure what it is yet. Maybe 8 or 10 years ago, I was doing a panel with an editor and two editors for a really great magazine. And one of the students asked, like, what kind of work can we submit to you? And they take photographs, visual art, fiction, essays, all of it. And the student just said point blank, like, what kind of stuff can you send us? And she said, send us your best work. And it sounded like a non-answer at the time, like, send us your best work. And then she kind of explained, she's like, send us the work that you have to write. It is like the most important thing that you need to be writing. Now, these are what she said and what the producer said are the same thing, which is, what is the thing that only you can do? What is the thing that you know better than others? What is the kind of music, like, it has taken me a long time. I play the drums, and I'm not very good, Rebecca, but I do love to play. But it took me a long, long time to realize that, like, which is so dumb, that like my perfect music, like the perfect band, the perfect type of music that I should be playing because of my past, my musical history, where I've come from, what I love. It's best described as like the music of the band Little Feat, which doesn't even exist anymore. I never even liked Little Feat when I was younger. But it took a long time to realize that that was my music. This was how I played, and this is how I like to play. And when it came to writing my first book, The World's Largest Man, it took me a long time to figure out I thought I should be writing a funny book, and that was wrong. Anything I write is going to be funny because I am so funny. But see, I was trying to make you laugh. There, you're laughing. Anything I write is going to be funny. I did my father's eulogy. It was funny because, I mean, it was sad. I was crying, but it was also funny. I've done other eulogies. All of them were funny because it's just who I am. So that's asking the wrong question. The question is, what are the themes and questions that have lived with you for so long that they determine how you think and how you move through the world? Mm-hmm. And it took me 10 years from the moment I started trying to write a book. It took me 10 years to figure out that the answer to that question was, at least for my first book, that one of the biggest questions was, who was my father? How were we different? How did I come from him? I felt so different from him, and not just him, but how did I come from the South? Because there's so much about me that feels not that. Mm-hmm. And yet so much about that, or everything about the South and my father especially, shaped me and who I am. And so getting to those questions, that was where I found that book. Right. And we can talk about that, but that's the most important question. Anybody who wants to write or play music or make art, what is the thing they have to be doing?
That's great. I think that's a good question, and it's a great question, and it's one that isn't it always like one of your in the book in Act 2, which is wisely called The Ass in the Chair. That's the chapter where you were Googling and you were making a list of the great first lines of a book. Yeah. And that's, I think, is so relatable. And I remember when I got to that part thinking, oh no, here we go again. Because to me, it's like when you ask someone who has great skin how, what their secret is, they say drinking water. And in every single book about writing, it's the very obvious, like you have to sit down and write. You have to do it. But I think what I appreciated is that you took it, and then in that response as well, that you took it further, and you could write anything, but the thing that is uniquely your story is what's going to be, I think that's where the authenticity and the vulnerability comes through to the reader.
Mm-hmm. Even if you're writing a novel, or let's say it's a genre novel, like, you want to write mystery books or even if maybe you want to write true crime, like that's not about your life, right? Hopefully true crime isn't. But even if it's something that's not about you, the work itself is going to address questions that have always been important to you. Now, some people may be lucky and more self-aware and kind of know what matters to them. I mean, it seems like, there are always young people in any generation who know. Like, I remember, when I was in like 11th or 12th grade and I went to this honors program one summer, and like all the smart kids there were talking about how they wanted to make the world a better place. And, they wanted to help, reduce greenhouse gases. And I was like, these people are on drugs. Like how would they know? Like I didn't know what was important to me. I was just sort of alive and just wanted to be alive and have fun and be funny and make people laugh. So it took me a long time to figure out the answers to those questions. So it's almost like when it comes to writing, there's a side of it that's technical, and there's a side of it that is I guess you would say it's about content or theme or idea.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of have to chop at both sides of the tree continually. And a breakthrough on the technical side can help you on the content side or the story side and vice versa. So like looking at, whenever I would get sort of stumped, to continue the tree metaphor, whenever I would get stumped with what my story was about, I would go to the technical questions. Like, how do you start a book? What does it look like? What are the first lines? How long is a book? How many words is it? Nobody talks about books in terms of words, but most writers think in terms of word count, because that's how you measure sort of how much you've done that day. And I mean, there were times when and so I guess that's a bit of advice, which is if you're a writer and you don't know what to do technically, think about your story and what matters. And that's as much therapy as it is writing. Mm-hmm. And if you've got your story, but you don't know how to write it, then do some technical research. And so one thing I would do is, as I mentioned, I would just open up, great books and look at the first line. Sometimes I'd go to the romance section and just pull out I'd get 10 books and just what is the first paragraph? What is happening? Because clearly it doesn't matter if it's a romance or memoir, they're doing something in there to make you read the next thing. And so I would read all these and see if I could get ideas. Another thing I did once I realized I was trying to write funny stories is, I went to the sort of standard, the gold standard, which is David Sedaris, sort of the one, writer who's he's just lionized by everybody. Even if you don't love his work, you can't argue with his success and all of his books, and he's written about himself, and somehow he's become able to do that continually over many years. I think his first book came out 25 years ago. And so I remember going through all of his books, because my question was this, and I'm telling this story so that people who are watching realize how much just legwork it is to write. So my question was, if I'm writing a memoir, should I be writing about what's happening in my life now or what was happening then? I had lots of funny stories to tell about all those things, but I didn't know how to tie it all together, because I didn't know what my big story was. Now, I'm working on a third nonfiction book, it's not really a memoir, but it kind of is. So that's 3 memoirs with 3 sort of different stories of who I am. I have no problem with that, mostly because I'm a sociopathic egomaniac. I have no problem with doing that, each one of them needs a slightly different story. What is this? What am I learning? How am I growing? How am I changing? Anyway, so I was struggling with, am I talking about my childhood, or am I talking, because at the time I had 3 or 2.5 very young children, and I was having a lot of funny stories with them. Mm-hmm. So I took all of Sedaris's books and I created a spreadsheet, and I charted which stories were about his past and which were about his present, and then how long they were. And then I rated them based on, 1, 2, or 3, whether I really liked them or not. And it took a week to do that project.
Yeah.
And was it good? I guess what I learned, I don't know. I think what I learned is that there was no rhyme or reason to it. That he moved with confidence from the past to the future, and he didn't care about making it make sense.
Right.
And so what that gave me courage to do is that, it doesn't matter. Nobody really cares, right, as long as it's a great story. And in the first book, if you notice, in The World's Largest Man, many of the essays are almost structured like a comedy routine or like a moth story, where I open up with Harrison standing on a stage talking, like Harrison now, talking about some topic. Mm-hmm. And then slowly you get the wavy lines and you go back to the past, and then we kind of come back to the present at the end of it. And I just because of that research with the David Sedaris books, that's how I got that idea for the first book. The second book is less like that, in the sense that the second book is more chronological from a beginning of the story to the end. So I didn't have to come up with a way to open up each chapter. It was just naturally opened up by the previous chapter. So I just say all that to say, going to the bookstore or the library, or opening up and going to Google Books on your computer if you're at home, and just digging into how other people put books together will help makes them less romantic and more like real things that you can make.
Right. No, I love that. I love and that's totally something that I would do, is chart out. It took me a while to get comfortable with the idea that even just, on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting with a book during business hours was okay. And that no one else was judging me for it. I just realized I was judging myself. But I related a lot to all of the lists that you did for, there's a lot of lists in this book, and now it sort of makes sense. I can see you diagramming these and charting them out, which is probably why I related to it so much. I dug up this a list almost a little over a year ago that I wrote of just on my phone. I think I was like fired up with myself. Things I do that are related to writing but aren't writing. Read every book ever written about writing, attend writing workshops, research favorite writers, watch the movies their books become, research all the reasons to not write a book, subscribe to email newsletters about writing and book publishing, get really into poetry, start reading about how to write poetry, learn to write poetry, take a master class on writing, consider one on comedy writing, but decide not funny enough. Write notes, read notes, listen to podcasts of Oprah interviewing writers, do everything that is recommended in the artist's way, talk to book agents, remember that I need a platform before I can even think about a book, build a platform, realize that what's really needed is an audience, start an Instagram account, meet with more book agents, finish writing an essay that I've been writing for 8 months, but has no home.
Yeah.
And I come up with these lists, and so as I was reading your book, I related so much to the various lists of, whether it was the great first line or whatever it was. That was very relatable.
It's a way to get control over the chaos of what's happening in your mind a little bit.
Right. So I'm thinking trying to decide which of these should have you do a reading. I think my favorite part of, I loved and you can probably speak to this or read it as well. I love early on in the book when you talk about the 2 stages of the dream. Mm-hmm. That I loved. And then the part that I remember reading probably on that treasured last airplane ride of 2020, about how you wrote about how to perceive the source code of a story. And I think so many books go through that, here's the technical structure of the book that you should be writing. But the approach that when you write about the realization of thinking that way and then how you changed your thinking, and I appreciated the pearl.
It's so funny. Just like let the source. I'll just read that. I'll read that little bit. I'll read both. Hold on. Yeah, I'll read the source code thing. This is in page 107 of the book. I think it's 107.
Yes.
And I talk about, so I have a PhD in playwriting, and then after that I got an MFA in creative nonfiction when I realized that I wanted to be teaching and writing stories and not plays, although I do love plays and screenplays. But it took me a long time, mostly because I'm dumb. I realized how dumb I was. My wife has been telling me this for years, and I don't mean to sound like some stupid comedian, but I really am very slow, and it takes me a long time to absorb and understand things. And it was very frustrating to me, even after getting a PhD in playwriting, which I don't know how I did that, but I still didn't quite understand how stories worked. I was definitely just so enthralled to their magic and the idea of like what's always fascinating to me is how movies and books like compress time, and yet the effects of time are still there, but the time itself is not. I know that sounds weird,
Yeah.
but like, you know, like what a montage can do in a movie, like like going from the moment before a montage to the moment after a montage. It could be like 6 months in the hero's life, but in the movie it's 30 seconds, or in the book it's 1 paragraph or 2 paragraphs.
Right.
And that was always fascinating to me, and I never knew how it worked. Anyway, so I wrote this passage here. Let me figure out where it is. So I wrote this passage. Where is this? Page 107. So I used to think that it was like A happens, B happens, C happens, D happens, and that's not it at all. I learned how to perceive the source code of a story. The skeleton key to the whole thing, at least for me, was so simple as to be upsetting. Create a question in the heart of the hero and in the mind of the audience, and go about answering this twin interrogation with each new sentence via concrete images and the totally possible but highly improbable behavior of humane characters in occasionally inhumane circumstances. Before, I thought a story was this: event A, event B, event C, event D, etc., the end. But a story is not that at all. A story is an old-fashioned treasure hunt, and what makes it so very hard for the writer is that when you start to write, you don't necessarily know the nature of the treasure or even what the map looks like. All you need is a human with an empty place inside them they're hoping to fill. And that's what a story is. And we turn the page because we have the hole in us too, and we're all trying to fill it, and we're hoping the story will give us some ideas about how to do that. And then that's sort of the thing that I learned. Now, it's still hard. I can phrase it in 2 paragraphs, which is nice, but what's hard, but it at least helps you know what the right question is, which is, what does the hero need? What does he want that he doesn't have?
Right.
And there's usually 2 layers of that. There's an external want and there's an internal want too. Mm-hmm. And I don't know about other writers, but I don't know those things before I start at all. I figure them out as I go. Like I know that generally something interesting is happening in this story. That's why I want to tell this particular story from my life, but I don't know what was happening. I don't know why. Like, I mean, there's a story in my first book about a football game, and it's called The Wishbone, and it's about this time my dad made me cheat in a football game to help him win. And that's weird. That's a weird memory. My dad made me cheat in a football game that was completely inconsequential. But I'd always told this story over, and so this is, I'm just going to tell this little anecdote because this illustrates kind of what I just read. So I knew that was an interesting story because every time I told people, it made them laugh. That was all the evidence I needed that there was some treasure in that story. Mm-hmm. I did not know why they laughed, but I knew, I mean, aside from my dad made me cheat, that was kind of funny. And the cheating was that I was 14 years old and played in a game of 10 and 11-year-old kids. And I was so much bigger than them. Mm-hmm. And I told this story a lot. So that's all you need. If you tell a story a bunch, that is God's way of telling you there's something there. Now, when I told this story at bars and parties, I did not know what the treasure was. I had not written a story. It was just something I said. It was an anecdote, a cocktail anecdote. So when I first attempted to write that story, I literally just wrote down everything that happened. How did we get to that point? What was my experience with sports? When my father asked me to play, what it was like driving to the game, what it was like playing, what it was like after. And it was the worst story. It was so boring. And it was so confusing to me. I was like, every time I tell this story, people laugh. But when I read it on paper and I put everything there, you would think it would be better because I would remember everything that happened. But it was not better. It was worse. And what I realized was, and other writers have talked about this, in various ways. Vivian Gornick writes about this, and I think it's called The Story and the Situation, I think is the name of her book. But there are two parts of any story. And there's the external part of this, that's the situation. Where were you? Mm-hmm. Like if you always tell the story about the time your dog got out of the house and you went searching for her and it took you all day to find your dog. If you always tell that story and people are so heartbroken and they're moved and they laugh, that's not the story. The story, you're just describing the pieces of it that make up the coat, mm-hmm. right? And so in my case, it was this weird football game that I played, and my dad and me, and how I dressed for the game and what happened during the game. Those were not the story. Those were the situation. Those were the scenic elements. Those were all the pieces, the things that are on Bob Ross's palette, all the colors. That's all that stuff is. The story is, why did it happen? Why do you keep telling this? What do you hope to, what demon are you working out when you tell this story? And which made me then go, oh, this story is not about cheating in a football game. This story is about my father and I not ever being able to connect with sports, that I never lived up to my father's hopes with sports. And I think the reason I agreed to play in that game, because I was 14 and I could have said no. The reason I played in that game is because I had disappointed my father so many times on the field of battle, because I didn't want to play sports. I wasn't who I was. And I disappointed him so many times. I'm almost going to cry thinking about it. I disappointed him so many times that when he finally asked me to do this ridiculous thing, I said, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it because he's asking me and I don't want him to lose this game, even though it was cheating. So it's ridiculous. And so once I realized, oh, the story is what I want. It's what I just read, like you have to have, the hero has to have an empty place. My empty place was, I disappointed my dad so many times. That's why I agreed to play the game. Why did my dad ask me to do it? Because he loved watching me play. He loved it. And when I figured that out, the whole story changed. And all the scenes got put in different parts, and other things that were important to the story that I never thought about before came pouring into the story. And in some ways that became kind of like one of the sort of anchors of that first book. And that process became, what I learned in that process became so much an important piece of the second book too, in my own way of understanding stories.
Yeah, no, I think I loved that passage. And because it's very succinct, but it definitely drives it home. So sort of related to both books, because you write about your experiences and therefore your family. As I said, one of the many reasons why I enjoyed Congratulations so much was because of how you describe the relationship with your wife as you're writing. And my husband and I have had a lot of those similar, funny, only in hindsight moments where, I come back from some life-changing trip and I pronounce like, I'm going to be a writer. I loved you. There was one short excerpt that I wanted to read, and then I connected it to something that you said later. So in chapter 6, you said, I loved my wife, and I also did not love my wife. For not understanding how impossible the task of writing a book seemed, made all the more impossible by its apparent triviality. And one, I think any writer can relate to that, because it's, again, to me, it goes back to like reading the book on the Tuesday afternoon. It seems so trivial or so frivolous, but it's part of it. But then something else that I tied it to was, I believe it's later, your daughter, I believe your oldest daughter asked you if you're a writer and says, because mom said that you are. And your response was, I don't know. And I think it's such a profound thing. Again, I think it's a very unique problem for writers. You don't hear the firefighter saying, well, I don't know, like if I'm a firefighter. But with writers, because it's the same thing, my husband will introduce me to people and say that I'm a writer. But then they'll say something to me about writing and I say, well, no, I do write, but everyone writes, to your point earlier. And can you just speak a little bit to the dynamics of, I think we've established that writing is it's for weirdos, right? But can you talk a little bit about the experience of both writing about family as well as the process of writing? And, like for me, I know that a lot of what I do write is about my life. And so therefore it touches on family members and my husband and friends. And but then on the other side of it, the process of writing it is, again, I might be reading a book on a Tuesday afternoon, but if we're out and about and something comes to me, I'm going to plop down on the curb while we're walking somewhere to meet somebody because an idea just came and I have to sit down and I have to write it down right then. And I know that's such a disruptive, confusing thing for people around me. So it's sort of a twofold process, both the writing about family and sort of how you navigate that, but then also how you live that.
Yeah. So the writing, I mean, they're definitely two different things. I mean, they're not, for me, it's all one big thing. I mean, in some ways, everybody can relate a little bit because of social media, because you're posting things about your spouse, about your family on social media. And obviously, it's very easy to post very sweet and sentimental things on social media, but every now and then you want to post like, oh my gosh, can you believe what my husband just did? Or look at my kids. Or, I remember there was a period when everybody was questioning the ethics of like posting funny things about your children on social media because they're going to find it one day and then they'll hate you and it's invasive of their privacy. So I guess in some ways everybody has an experience. Like if I'm going to say something kind of funny and slightly embarrassing about my wife on social media, like I'm definitely going to think twice about that. And most people will, right? And it's very much the case when writing a book. Like you always want the balance of what you say about any family member to be largely positive compared to what you say about yourself. I mean, that's just a real sort of technical inside bit of knowledge. If you're, one, I don't know if I think I wrote this in the second book. Let me see if there's the passage in there. Hold on. No. Oh wait, here it is. I got it. I'm looking at a PDF of the book, so I'm just searching. Oh, I don't think it's there. Anyway, it's a line, something like, if you're going to talk about your mother-in-law's mustache, then at least also talk about how great her cornbread is, meaning that you don't ever want to seem like you're attacking somebody just to attack them. Obviously, when it's in a book, you have more power because you're shaping the story. It's in a book. It's in a bookstore. And so you have to use that power very wisely and very gently. And, one thing I always tell students is if you can write with love, if you can write with a sense that you have to be open to people fighting about what happened in the story, right? Like the way I do it is when I'm writing about my family, I imagine that I'm telling a story at the dinner table and everybody in that story is there at the dinner table and we're all talking. Mm-hmm. And I'm just telling a fascinating story. So everybody's listening to me. I'm doing the voices. It's very dramatic and it's very funny, but I have to be ready at any point for somebody to go, it's not how I remember it, and they will do that. And in a good family, that happens all the time. My daughter, yesterday, my youngest daughter was trying to tell a story. They were babysitting and they lost a garage door opener. And my youngest daughter, God bless her, she can't tell a story. She just can't. It's like they get so long. She told me, she was trying to explain to me what happens in Frozen 2. And it took her an hour and a half to tell me, which is the length of the movie. So anyway, so my poor youngest daughter starts telling me about this losing the garage door opener. And my wife goes, just hush, let me tell this, it'll be better. And I was like, gosh, she's going to give the kid a complex. But my wife told the story then. And then something happened that my wife left out. So my oldest child was like, no, you forgot about blah, blah, blah. So when you're writing, if you can imagine everybody in the story sort of sitting around, if you can be enchanting and if you can be compelling, you can hold the attention, you can tell the story. You don't want to piss anybody off so much that they leave the table. So when you're writing, how are you going to talk about them to make them not leave the table?
Mm-hmm.
Every like every now and then you're going to have to say something painful, and you have to decide who you never want to see, who you're okay with never seeing again, mm-hmm. Or who you're okay with never seeing at major holidays. For me, it was my wife and my mother. Those were the two people. Everybody else, I was fine with never seeing again. I wouldn't want that to be the case, but I knew that it might have to be the case if I said some of the things I needed to say in both of these books. And so for my wife and my mother, I made sure that I told the truth, but I did it with a spirit of love and of grace and mercy, knowing that I would have to sleep in the same bed with my wife for the rest of my life, God willing, and that I would have to, take care of my mom for the rest of her life. And so what that meant was every now and then interviewing them about something I was writing about, like, do you remember what happened with the so-and-so? Just kind of getting their perspective on it. With my wife, there were two particular stories that I have written and published that were really delicate that I wanted her to read before I even sent them to the editor. Usually don't do that. I usually would just write my thing. My wife is a very funny person, and she's the second funniest person in my marriage. And she's very funny. Most people say she's much funnier than I am. But those people don't have a clear sense of what good humor is. But my wife is so funny that we're used to being funny at a party. We're used to both telling stories that are kind of embarrassing about one another. And so that helped with my book. And another thing that helped, because there's not just like one sort of key to it in writing about family. I'm talking about writing about my wife because all these same things can apply to any other family member, but she's sort of the most important one, is that when I was published, so about half of the chapters from my first book had been published previously, and one at a time, often one a month, one every 6 weeks for 2 to 3 years. And so I would publish one and then put it on Facebook, and then she would see it, her friends would see it, and they'd all talk about how funny it was. And, oh my gosh, this is such a funny story. And, so then it's like, oh, Harrison writes about his wife. Okay. And she's kind of okay with the attention, and I liked the attention. And then, 2 months later, I post another story that she's in. Eventually, after 2 or 3 years, it's just the thing that you're used to.
Right.
And so when a book comes out, it's like, boiling the frog in the pot of lukewarm water. You just do it over time and people get used to it. So that's another trick. Like, do it over time, do it with love. And in severe cases, you might show it to somebody beforehand and let them give you feedback. And, I'm committed to writing true stories, and I just happen to write them about my family because these are the things that happen to me. And I've been very fortunate that, I live with a very merciful family. My kids think it's funny right now and kind of cool. They probably won't when they're older and they realize that there are stories about their naked bodies, when they were 2 years old or something. But I'm sure it'll be cool to them too. Also, never underestimate people's desire to be validated by being in a book. Random strangers that I've written about, random acquaintances that I've said things that might be construed as a little indelicate about them are so excited just to be in a book. It's pretty funny. Did that answer one of your questions?
It did.
What was the other one?
Yeah. I mean, I think your point, like, it is valid. They're two very separate things when you're writing about family and also living with your family as a writer, but they go hand in hand.
Yeah. It's been a long process. I mean, I've been married for how long? 17 years now. And I wrote my first story in which my wife appeared as a character in 2000, in the first year we got married. And that was really weird because I was putting dialogue into her mouth that was it was dialogue. She said something like that. I mean, obviously I don't walk around with a recorder, but the dialogue that I give characters is dialogue that I would give them if I was telling this story in their presence. So it's dialogue that is believable and within the character and the facts of the story. And I gave her a couple of lines of dialogue, and it was really weird. And I was like, "Hey, I put you in this story. You want to check this out?" And she was like, she didn't care. She was like, "Oh, whatever, it's fine." It was in a magazine she didn't read, and it wasn't like a super important magazine, so she didn't care. She cared when she found out it was going to be in libraries across America. She cared a little bit more, but anyway.
Yeah, that's funny. All right. Well, I also want to be cognizant of our time here.
Yeah.
One thing that because it's related to what I write, and it's something that I'm always curious about, is if the topic of writing as therapy. I think it's either writing as therapy or it's writing and doing that digging on yourself that will send you to therapy. I think they both can happen, both can be positive. But is that something that can you touch on that a little bit? You mentioned a little bit earlier about having to sit and do the deep introspective work of figuring out what it is, the story that you're trying to tell, and why it has meaning.
Yeah. Well, I definitely used to look down on that idea that writing was therapy. It felt selfish and self-involved. But I just didn't really understand how therapy worked at the time that I thought that. I think writing anything is a kind of therapy because it's a kind of learning and knowing and digging down into what things mean, right. Even if it's a fictional story, but especially writing nonfiction about your life is very therapeutic because you essentially are doing what you do with a good therapist, which is you talk about something that's on the top of your mind, mm-hmm. and the therapist asks questions that go a little further down inside you, right. until you have a moment where you're like, oh my gosh, that's why I did that. Or I'm attracted to dangerous people, or I self-sabotage, because my father never experienced success. So maybe that's why I'm afraid of it, because I'm afraid I can't handle it. Like you have all these illuminations. Right. In good therapy, you will have those kind of illuminations and it will blow your mind. Right. And writing memoir is exactly the same way. You just get there by asking yourself those questions. You get there through revision. Like something about this story doesn't feel genuine, doesn't feel authentic. That's because it's still like up here. It hasn't gone down enough. Mm-hmm. Into the aha moment, the illumination moment, the enlightenment moment. And so for me, I'm writing about a topic right now that I've thought a lot about my whole life. And I think I know what I think about this topic, but even as I'm writing, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's why I think that. That's why I made that choice. And that's part of the sort of discovery of writing. That's the joy of it, because you know yourself better. I would say that most of my relationships are better now because I've written so much about my life. Mm-hmm. Because I understand more clearly why I maybe resented somebody in the past. I understand more clearly some decisions I made because I'm selfish and vain, other decisions I made because I'm fearful or prideful or whatever. And so I can't speak for other writers because I'm only me, but it has helped me so much become a fuller person, because I'm lucky enough to be writing about my own life and have had good enough teachers and mentors to help me see that the real question is, why did this happen? Why are you doing this? What is meaningful? What have you learned about life? What can you share with others about your own illuminations? And I'm just lucky enough to be able to do it and make it hopefully funny most of the time.
Yeah, for sure. And so just in closing here, what do you think quarantine, the time of COVID, what do you think it's going to do for writers, better or worse, coming out on the other side of it?
It's going to create so many terrible writers. But that's okay. That's okay, because all writers are terrible, at least at the beginning. I don't know. I think it will create a lot of crisis moments for people. This year will, and that will cause a lot of writing breakthroughs. I mean, a lot of people are just at home a lot, so they're just writing a lot. A lot of people aren't writing because they're not leaving their house and they're not kind of getting their blood pumping, and they're feeling a little static. But 2020 will definitely be a year that all of us remember, and we will all it's like I've often wondered and longed for a decade like the 60s that my parents lived through, because they all talk about it with so much sort of nostalgia, and so many things happened with the assassination of Kennedy and King and Woodstock and the Beatles and everything. And I think 2020 is going to be our 60s. It's going to be like our moment that we look back and it marks a before and an after. Things are, in some ways I feel like 2020 has sort of been the culmination of about the last 4 or 5 years of race in America and politics. A lot of things that we're talking about right now we started talking about 4 or 5 years ago, at least in earnest nationally. But I think 2020 will mark a kind of end of a certain period in American history in our own lives. And so there will be a lot of fertile writing around that, and just moments of change and evolution individually in people, but also collectively. So I think great things will come out of that, because great things always come out of bad things.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And so is there anything that we didn't cover, or anything that I didn't ask that you think must be shared with writers?
No, I would say a lot of people ask me, since the first book is my first book, and the second book, in some ways I talk about how I wrote the first book. That's kind of a reduction of what these 2 books are about. So what I like to tell people is that they're kind of interchangeable, and they're not sequels. You can read one before the other. You don't have to. They're not like Harry Potter movies. You don't have to read them in any particular order, or even read both of them. The first book is really about the South, and it is such a funny book and crazy. There's so many bad words in it. And then the second book is a little more about calling and how you become who you become. And so I guess you could say the first book's kind of about that as well. But no, we talked about all the big stuff. So thank you. This is great.
No, thank you. We covered a lot of ground. And as someone who, it's funny because I can get hung up sometimes on needing to be sure I'm reading the books in the right order. And I knew that I'd read this one first. I actually preferred having read them in this order.
Yeah.
I feel it gave me a different appreciation of World's Largest Man, definitely. Well, thank you again. I'm really appreciative of your time, and I know everyone watching this will be appreciative as well. It's great to finally connect with you. I feel like it's a nice bookend for me personally, having picked up that book at the tail end of the old normal, and now we're getting a chance to connect here at the start of the new normal.
Well, thank you for inviting me on, and it's been a pleasure for me to reveal my most intimate secrets to you during your quarantine.
Yes, definitely. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks everybody for watching.